Good morning, Newport Covenant Church. It is so good to worship. I just realized I have a mic and then I'm pulling the mic down. It is so good to worship with you all this Sunday. I'm Pastor Eunice Doe, and together with my husband, Bob, we officially launched our church plant, The Table Seattle, almost 2 years ago now with our denomination, Evangelical Covenant Church. Now, in the last while, we've become good friends with Pastor Paul and Britta Berger, and when they asked me to guest preach, I was hesitant, yet honored, and I'll get into that more later. I think I have a picture of us and sorry. I have a lot of slides. So that's our people at our church, and that's me with the burgers. Obviously, having to eat together is a big deal to me. But first, let me introduce my family. My husband, Bob, who's also sitting right there. He is the most steady, chill, and easygoing person that I know. He's also an amazing cook and a great volleyball player. If you'll play, you should chat with him. Sure, he'll love to play with you all. And these are our children. Our son, Noah. They're both sitting there, too. Our son, Noah, is going to be a sophomore at Washington State University. He is studying computer science, and he wants to double major in music performance. I am glad it's the summertime because I get to see him at home, but he is going back at the end of the month. I'm very sad. Naomi, our baby girl, is going to be a senior in Mercer Island High School. She is the most sarcastic and funniest person that I know, and she has impeccable wit and timing. There's nothing like having a teenage daughter to keep you on your toes, and we're never bored when she's around. So before we dive into Psalms, I want to share a little bit about my journey as a pastor, which, bear with me, it will tie into Psalm 23, but I actually haven't always been in ministry. 22 years ago, I graduated with a degree in psychology because my parents advised me not to get my first degree in art or design. They were hoping for something more stable. So after earning my BA, I ventured into fashion design for over 10 years, then moved into UX, UI design, later marketing and branding, leading design at companies like T-Mobile and Nike at the end. Now, during our church planting journey, through individual and collective promptings, I discerned that God was calling me into ministry. Now, this path has been challenging, to say the least. It often seemed way more convenient and financially responsible to avoid it altogether. But I am happy to say that I recently passed my bivocational ministry licensing with the Covenant in April, and I will be attending seminary in the fall. Thank you. You all are so encouraging. So I grew up in a very traditional Chinese culture. I never saw women pastors in church settings. Intellectually, I think I disagreed, but I knew they could and should if they're called, but I never saw it modeled. So I would never have imagined I would be up here preaching to you. Even if you asked me like 2 to 3 years ago, I'd be like, never in a million years would I think about this. It's because I've always felt like an outsider and an imposter in my faith and at church. So my parents both grew up in Hong Kong. Lovely picture of them in college. They met in college at PLU in Tacoma, and then continued the education in University of Washington and Columbia University in New York. My dad graduated with degrees in physics and computer science. My mom earned her master's degree in math. Those genes definitely skipped a generation. At least with me. Maybe when my brother was still there. But my parents moved back to Hong Kong after graduating and planned for my brother and me to be born in Seattle so we could hold US passports before the Hong Kong turnover in China, ensuring stability for our future. I don't even know what my kids are gonna eat for dinner tonight, let alone what nationality I should have them be in years before they're born. So I was born in 1980, part of the micro-generation or crossover generation of Zennials, sometimes called the Oregon Trail generation. I remember a time before the digital age, but barely. I played so much video games growing up, and sometimes Christianity feels like a video game that I keep losing because I can't level up. It's like a boss I can't beat. In Hong Kong, I attended a prestigious all-girl Anglican school, that's me, where spirituality and academics felt like it was based on performance and achievements. And then moving to Seattle when I was 14, I felt alienated and struggled to belong both in school and in church. You saw me, I was wearing uniforms my whole life. I didn't know how to dress, it was wild. So being third culture, I wasn't Chinese enough when I go back to Hong Kong, and I wasn't Asian American enough when I was in Seattle. So in high school, I entered in a very unhealthy, abusive relationship, and when I finally gathered enough courage to bring it up to my church leadership, I wasn't believed and I was shunned. And then in college, a short-term missions trip to Cambodia, I went on a short-term missions trip in Cambodia. It really shook up my faith because I stood at the Genocide Museum questioning where my benevolent God was in the midst of all this pain and suffering. And when my doubts were voiced, they were met with judgment, like I wasn't faithful enough, like I should read the Bible more. And my frustrations with the church grew, which led me to disconnect even more. It was like game over. So I just start shifting more and more away, like in my heart. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, I was in a rut. My grandparents passed away in Hong Kong. I was far away from them. I witnessed the violence and racial injustice around us, and knowing my church was not a safe place for me to say anything. So luckily I have Bob, who's very kind and loving. I discussed all this internal struggles I have, and I reached out to one of his professors at SPU, where he went to seminary, Dr. Carrie Dearborn. Now, she's Bob's professor. She's not my professor. But she listened to me weep angry tears at God for hours on the phone. This lady doesn't really know me that well, but I was just like, I couldn't take it anymore. But she gave me space to lament, very honestly. And it was only after that deep crying was allowed that I found space to have a transformative experience with God. And realizing that Jesus was there with me all along, crying with me through my pain. My Creator has room for my lament. Now, with all this painful journey, now it has brought me to a space where I have a deep passion to make sure our church plant is a safe space for those who have been deeply hurt. And that is why I can stand before you today, embracing my call to share the love and grace of God that I have experienced. Pastor Britta mentioned in her sermon a couple weeks ago that Psalm put into words what we often find speechless. And maybe that's why it's one of my favorite books. My heart really welcomes poetry that brings a full range of raw human emotions into prayer, showing that there is a place where we can invite God to who we are wholly, even the parts that we think are unworthy, to be said out loud. So when Pastor Paul and Britta gave me Psalm 23, I was first very relieved. I was like, thank goodness I didn't get one of those more colorful psalms with violent language about smiting one's enemies. Not that I wouldn't have risen to the challenge, but as someone who is new to this congregation, it would have required quite a bit of setup. So when I heard Psalm 23, I was like, oh, good. Everyone has heard of Psalm 23. Oh, no. Everyone has heard of Psalm 23. What is your earliest memory of Psalm 23? Some of us might have grown up in a church, so this is an all too familiar passage. Even if you didn't grow up at church, you might have heard the scripture at funerals, counseling, or offered as comfort. Especially in contrast to some of the very violent language in Psalms, I grew up thinking, wow, this one is such a nice, passive, restful, and beautiful psalm. But today, I want to challenge us to defamiliarize our default thinking of Psalm 23. Because, brothers and sisters, Psalm 23 is an active psalm of justice and reconciliation. In Psalm 23, the word says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." So let's break it down a little bit. First, focusing on verse 1 to 3. "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet water. He refreshes my soul." This is the most quoted part of Psalm 23. So growing up, I've always envisioned pleasant meadows, a noble shepherd herding the sheep lovingly and very gently. And when I read this passage, I usually think of an image like this. Sheep are vulnerable creatures, prone to wander, unable to defend themselves. They depend entirely on their shepherd for survival. Likewise, we depend on God for our sustenance, protection, and direction. And sheep are fluffy and cute, but can also be stubborn, not always very smart, easily startled, and always hungry. Sound a lot like us. So I am known in my family to get very hangry, like angry hungry, like all the time. If my husband says to the kids, "Let's feed mom," the kids know, don't talk to mom, let her eat first. And if they point out how unreasonable I am in the moment, which is very true, I am being very unreasonable, I probably wouldn't hear it. I'm very stubborn when I'm hangry. They need to feed me first. Similarly, a shepherd has to provide, being a strong but not overpowering presence, because if a shepherd comes on too forcefully, then they're no different than the predators. If the shepherd is too gentle, then the sheep might not listen and just wander off without any realization of danger. Now, to add a little more understanding, I was reading about what some scholars think about shepherds in general about that time. And some scholars believe that after the Israelites settled in Canaan and transitioned into a more agricultural society, shepherding actually declined in prominence. And this shift, influenced by their time in Egypt, where shepherds were looked down upon, led to an even more of a decrease in pastoral lifestyle. So by the time it came to the time of the kings, agriculture and the development of towns had actually become more prominent, relegating shepherding to even lower social classes. So that is why David's rise from shepherd to king was particularly notable because shepherding was considered such a humble occupation. Not to mention his family background. He was the youngest son, so he was assigned to tend the sheep, highlighting that it wasn't maybe the most honorable or wanted profession out of the family. But in Psalm, shepherds were used to illustrate how God is life-giving. And even in Jesus' time, shepherds were often social outcasts. But shepherds were sent to announce the birth of Jesus, Emmanuel. Jesus is also our good shepherd. I think our God consistently uses people we overlook to reveal the divine. The marketing side of me kicks in and wants to tell God, hey God, it's me. Have you thought of how this is kind of bad branding? It doesn't look quite good on you. But I'm reminded that God is not interested in people's approval. So the Bible chooses the image of a shepherd to represent divine love. This choice challenges our society norms, elevating the humble and the marginalized. By identifying with the shepherds, God is actually aligning with the outcasts, offering them a place of importance. Now, the Bible is filled with stories of lower-class peasants and craftspeople unjustly dominated by landlords and imperial forces. So it brings up to the point that maybe each of us might read this passage a little bit differently, especially if you're going through something that's a little bit tougher, like people who face poverty, debt, crisis, racial and gender oppression, war, and persecution. I think this is more than just a gentle verse, but maybe it offers a hope for true Sabbath that is embodied in restoration and justice. If you read the second half of verse 3, it says, "He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake." When I read this line, when I was digging through a little bit more about the wording, it gave room for a pivot that I actually didn't expect, and it kind of changed my whole sermon. NIV, as we just read, says, "He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake." In the King James Version, it says, "He restoreth my soul, he leadeth me to the right paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Now, I've heard numerous sermons in my youth explaining right paths means God's guidance when we're lost so we won't go astray, which is reassuring. I've also heard that God reminds us we're never alone, so he directs us to make the right choices in life, which is, I agree with all of that. But maybe there's more to this word right or righteous. Robert Alter, an American professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at the University of California, Berkeley, has written a version that says, "He leads me on pathways of justice for his name's sake." We usually think right means correct, like right or wrong. Righteousness means good moral behavior. In scriptures, the word right, righteousness, and justice are interchangeable. So we don't often think of using the word justice as a word of righteousness. But if we include justice into this passage, we can see God's active grace. In verse 4, it says, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." So life is a journey. It's not always green pastures, especially if you're on the path of justice. It isn't an easy one. Sometimes it takes us to like the darkest, deepest valleys. We come face to face with sin, evil, and death. I didn't grow up in a space that was okay to talk about dark valleys. It's only okay to share after you get out of the dark valleys, then praise Jesus. But here we're given the freedom, and we don't have to fear the harm of confronting the powers of this world that oppress the marginalized because God is with us. We need to be a community that not only talk about the valleys, but journey the valleys together and with each other and with God. I like the language here. It says God's rod and staff. I feel like it contrasts a little bit with the instruments of violence in this earth. And to me, that gives me comfort. In verse 5, it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows." Even in the worst circumstances, with powers that wish us harm, God prepares us at the table a feast, providing sustenance and abundance in the wilderness. Oil is also very expensive at that time and often used sparingly, mostly for food and emergency medicine. But here God says, "My cup overflows." Now, my immigrant parents are some of the most hospitable folks that I know. They lived with my grandparents the generation before, who went through a war and had a scarcity mindset, always needing to take care of their own. Now, my parents didn't go through the war directly, but the effects still trickled down to them. They love to hoard manuals of appliances they don't own anymore. And we still have boxes of floppy disks and CDs that no one used at my house, and way too many boxes of Kleenex. Everything is bought because it was such a good deal, and you never know. However, when it came to eating, they were the best and most generous hosts. If you are my friend, even if my parents didn't know you, and you came to our house or to our family dinner, you would be welcomed with open arms. Probably why the name the table has an additional meaning beyond the Lord's table to us. In Asian culture, love is shown by asking, "Have you eaten?" Followed immediately by feeding you, whether or not you have eaten or not. So our family table will always be prepared with way too much food and good wine. And you don't have to do anything. You just have to pull up a seat and sit down and enjoy. So when I read, "You prepared a table before me," this is what I think of. What a wonderful imagery for someone who is always hangry. And this is all beautiful, all good and well, until we get to "in the presence of my enemies." I used to read this, and I feel very vindicated, especially regarding to those who have seriously hurt me. I like to think I was rightfully angry in my feelings. Those who have created some very toxic environments for me in my growth and my faith, I can now think, I win. God is on my side. I'm actually in. You're out. You're not accepted. Look at this feast for me. But brothers and sisters, we are all invited to sit together at God's table. God prepared the table for me, for you, for everyone. The good news is good because God extended his grace and love to all creation. God is in the business of feeding all people. God is setting a full table so our enemies might sit down and break bread with us. By sitting at God's table, we all need to humbly accept responsibility and the gift of forgiveness, even those who have hurt us. And remember, we've probably done our share of hurting and could be labeled someone else's enemy. We're all made in the image of God, so we need to see each other the same way. This is why the pathways of justice and reconciliation are not easy ones, but it's the journey we are called to embark on. The last verse, "Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." The final section is a prayer asking for God's help to stay committed to justice and righteousness, not just in one season, but throughout in our entire lives, trusting in guidance and support. I think Psalm 23 shows the immense love God has as the good shepherd. God is both an individual and communal God. The God who is my good shepherd is also your good shepherd and our good shepherd. The shepherd cares for the flock, and that means all of the flock. God's care is abundant and generous, meant to be lived in a beloved community, not a power-motivated one by greed, a scarcity mindset, or a zero-sum game. The God of Abraham is the same God that hears Hagar. The God that received my tears of anger is the same God that offers forgiveness to those who have harmed me. It doesn't mean God doesn't care enough for those who are hurt, or that we should have no proper boundaries for those who are trying to harm us. But it does mean God's love is so abundant, and God is still the one that will restore all things, the one who will uplift those who are abused, on the margins, forgotten, and poor. But that is also why we can't stay comfortable at the banquet table. The pathway of justice isn't just like a passive stroll, but it is a continuous call for us to actively journey together towards justice and reconciliation, a commitment to living out God's love and grace in our lives. We need to, in turn, keep our eyes open on this road and help those who are marginalized, working together to bring about God's kingdom here on earth. As we prepare for communion, let us reflect on the table God has prepared for us. This sacred practice reminds us of Jesus' abundant love, allowing all creation to be restored. Will you pray with me? God of mercy, thank you for being a God who enters the suffering of the world, who doesn't run from those in pain, but rushes to those who are bleeding and crying. We're grateful that your love cannot be separated from truth and justice. Thank you for preparing a table with provision and abundance, inviting us to be nourished and find rest and restoration through your grace and love. May we remember we are all made in your image, and remind us there is enough love for all of us. As we journey together, may you strengthen us to create places of welcome, reconciliation, and forgiveness. As we break bread, let us commit to justice and righteousness, guided by the Good Shepherd. In your name, amen.